Okay, everyone, welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to our event here on YouTube. This is being presented to you by Peace Islands Institute, New York. My name is M. Kelly. I have the pleasure of being the executive director at Peace Islands, New York. We have a very interesting topic for you today, religious freedom in corporate America, and it'll be presented to you by Brian Grimm, who is a founding president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, a corporate trainer and a leading scholar on international religious demography, and the pioneer of the study of the socio-economic impact of religious freedom. You can find out more about Brian's work at religiousfreedomandbusiness.org. You will have opportunities to ask questions. We'll be taking questions through the chat box to the right screen on YouTube. Please be clear and succinct when asking questions. Thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to Brian. Thank you, Brian. Welcome.
Great to be with you under these very unusual circumstances. I can't, it sounds like I've lost the transmission. Are you able to hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so would you like me just to begin by sharing a bit about what's going on in corporate America?
That'd be great, and your recent report as well. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, so something amazing is happening across the corporate environments in America. Something that's been in the works for 20 years among some companies like American Express, American Airlines, and Texas Instruments, and something that's relatively new for companies like Salesforce, Google, Apple, and some others. They are opening their workplaces to let employees bring their whole self to work. Usually when we hear that, it usually means, you think of race or ethnicity or, gender or sexual orientation. But more and more, that includes people's faith and beliefs. So in some companies like Texas Instruments that I mentioned, they've had faith-oriented employee resource groups for 20 years. American Express, Intel, some of these companies have had these groups for many years. Sometimes they started off first being a majority Christian country, that there was Christian groups meeting. But today you can find groups across the whole spectrum of belief, including groups like Baha'i, which is a relatively small group, of course, Christians, Muslims, Jewish groups, Buddhist groups, and within this umbrella, you also find other belief groups, such as agnostics and atheists join in this movement as well. Because when you think of the idea of religious freedom in the workplace or in our society, it's the freedom to have a faith, to change your faith, or have no faith at all. So within that, everybody's included. It's not just freedom for some and not others. So as American workplaces over the past years have engaged more in this movement towards greater diversity and inclusion in the workforce, and even on the board, at the board level and in many levels, they've often focused on other topics than religion. Sometimes afraid that religion could be an area for division rather than something that brings people together. But in the workplace, they have some basic ground rules. These groups are not there to proselytize. They're not there to sort of espouse certain dogmas or doctrines, but to bring people together with the simple mission that they're working in the company, and if their faith, if they can gather together with people of their same faith and support one another in accomplishing the work that they're there to do, then that's good for business. So in some companies, you might have multiple different groups, and each of them are out trying to recruit people who are like-minded to them to come work. And one of the unusual things that might seem unusual to some, but not to those working in the companies, is that when somebody can find others that believe like they do, that are similar to them in different ways, that makes them more comfortable in the workplace and more productive. So that's the movements that's going on. Now, it's not really coming from sort of a kumbaya kind of approach in the workplace, but there's solid research showing that companies that are more open and inclusive have better morale, better retention, better recruitment. People want to work at these kind of companies that allow them to bring their whole self to work, as opposed to make them keep maybe a central part of their believing outside the door and just come in and sort of be a robot here at work and go home and live life separate. So one of the things that we've seen in society as the generation that's coming up has come fully into the workforce, that people look at the workplace not merely as a place to make money, which is something that's of course central, but it's a place where they find meaning and purpose. So that's another aspect of this sort of movement within companies to allow people to bring this whole self of their whole selves to work, is that as they look for purpose in the work, if they disassociate that from purpose they find in life in general, then they're living a compartmentalized life that you can't tap some of your deepest ideas, innovations, motivations. And these are very important, especially as our economy has moved from primarily, you could say, making gadgets to providing services and creative, much more creative types of work, whether it's in computer programming or graphic design or providing a service that needs to help people. All of these things require much more engagement, you could say, of the soul than if you're just on an assembly line, producing a gadget. Though those kinds of workplaces also have tremendous spiritual needs. And I'll maybe mention one other aspect of this faith at work movement that is particularly, you could say, popular within manufacturing, is having chaplains in the workplace. So, people are familiar with chaplaincy in hospitals or in the military, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies and workplaces across America that hire chaplains and their own staff. The best known example of this is Tyson Foods, which is doing its best at this time to make sure our food supply continues. They provide a lot of the protein and meats that make their way to restaurants, but now supermarkets. So they employ chaplains across 27 states where they have plants working. So in these environments, people, especially during this time of the pandemic, have all kinds of needs, and the chaplains are there in the good times and in the challenging times to help people navigate these things spiritually as well as emotionally, and pitching in when other things come up, such as new employees or people having needs like housing and so forth. So this is really something that's been underreported, something that's not well known in sort of day-to-day life. It doesn't come up, but it's really an exciting new and growing movement that's sweeping workforces across the United States and the world.
And can you give us a rundown about the success stories within corporate America and some of the challenges? Your report mentions some of the issues that corporate America is facing. who was succeeding in this regards, and who was finding it more challenging in Fortune 100, for example?
Yeah, so in the Fortune 100 and Fortune 200, 300, within these top companies, we're seeing a lot of movement in the early stages among tech companies, where some of their, they have their top talent, and some of that top talent might be wanting to pray at work or have some sort of, spiritual expression in the workplace. And if they don't feel that side of them is welcome, uh, those employees report having a much different experience in the workplace, a less positive, welcoming experience, and they can be looking. So I know one big tech company that lost a top engineer to another tech company because he was looking for a more religiously inclusive environment. And so those kind of things don't have to happen more than once till management starts taking notice that this is an issue that needs to be paid attention to. Just as an example of how some of this works and how it's a benefit to a company, there's a company called Salesforce, which doesn't produce a product you buy on the shelf in a supermarket, but they provide customer service software for many top companies around the United States and around the world. And part of their client base are NGOs. They provide their services, a basic level of service, free for NGOs. And then for bigger NGOs, they contract with their services, everything from the Red Cross to, large religious denominations make use of their software. So when you have a company, just like every company, their clients, the people that use their services or buy their products in the United States and in the world are by and large people that have some faith, because research shows that most people in the world are affiliated with some faith. So if you have a company that's religiously tone deaf, then they're going to miss knowing how to best work with their clients, especially if their clients are coming from a religious basis. So Salesforce 3 years ago started what they call Faith Force within the company, which is a secular company that's providing a service. They have an employee group called Faith Force, and then that Faith Force then allows employees in the company to come together and collect around their shared interest in faith and belief. So when they have customers who are having some worries or problems, maybe from the religious sector, they have some employees they know that can, discuss intelligently with those clients some of the issues that they're facing. So that's one example. Just to give one more from Salesforce, it's not just the customer relationships, but it's also the employee internal relationships. So after incidents like last year's Easter church bombings in Sri Lanka, the massacre in the mosque in New Zealand, and the Tree of Life synagogue shootings, these groups like Faith Force at Salesforce and the other groups across corporate America are able to engage and hold vigils and reach out to employees who might feel vulnerable when these attacks affect their co-religionists, and that's made a big impact. Another example is thinking of religious clients. One of the largest growing music industries in the world is Christian music. And so if you're running some music business and you don't understand that market, you're going to miss out on a whole market share. So these groups bring sort of religious competency, a religious awareness to their companies. And that's good for the bottom line. It's good for employees, and it provides better service in the community. Now, some of the challenges, though, you ask about challenges. Some of the challenges come from um, having a very, you could say, secularized workplace, which is not bad in and of itself, because, if you think of what secular means, it means that, it's not dominated by any one faith. It's not a religious environment. And, that seems to be something that's logical for business. But what the challenge is that then if you start excluding people and making them not feel welcome because they are religious, then that's when it becomes a problem. So one of the challenges is for companies, and they rightly ask, how can we become more faith friendly, you could say, um, and don't step on some landmines and turn, make this into an environment where one religious group dominates and then others feel left out, or people who don't have a religious faith feel like they're on the outs. So I'd say that's one of the biggest challenges is for companies to understand and work out for their own company, how can we be inclusive of people's faith without it becoming an issue of exclusion for some and only inclusion for others.
And you produced the Ready report, Brian. Can you tell us about in some of the organizations why some made the top 10, differences of those in the top 10, for example?
Yes, so the report you're referring to is called the Corporate Religious Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Index, so the READY Index. And that report rated the Fortune 100 within America on their public discussion of how, you could say, faith-friendly they are. So it looked at compared their diversity and inclusion pages, what they're discussing on those pages, whether they mention they have faith groups, employee groups, whether they discuss religion as part of their diversity and inclusion program, and then whether or not they're offering any training on religious inclusion, as well as doing any sort of benchmarking on this topic. So most companies do a lot of work on measuring and documenting how inclusive they are on other categories, such as race is the top category. It's a category that's important because people get excluded historically and even today because of their race or ethnic background. Same with gender or sexual orientation, veteran status, disabilities or ability status. All of these things are things that companies track and benchmark. But this study we did was the first time we've applied some of those same criteria to seeing how well companies are doing when it comes to being inclusive religiously. So among the top 100 largest companies in the United States, only about 20% of them came out, you could say, on religion. And among those, companies like Google have scored very highly. Intel, American Airlines, Tyson Foods scored very highly. And the characteristic that has come about in these companies that are scoring more highly is that they've been able to make their workplaces religiously inclusive by allowing people to be authentic about their faith. So it's not having people come in with some sort of watered down version of themselves. So if you're a member of a Christian group or a Muslim group or a Jewish group, you don't have to then say, okay, I'm going to agree with everything that everybody else believes. No, instead it's saying, okay, we realize that we're different, but in that difference, in those differences that we have, recognizing those and celebrating those, there's strength. So that's the, I would say that's the common element that I've seen among the companies that are doing sort of leading in this area, is that they've been able to allow that faith expression to be authentic, and not just sort of a cliche, or have people give lip service to it, but it's more, they're allowed to have a more authentic expression of their faith.
Thank you. Brian, what would you recommend to those that aren't in the Fortune 100, smaller organizations, smaller companies? Is there a process that they can go through internally to be inclusive?
Yeah, so one of the pilot initiatives that we have is called the Faith-Friendly Workplace Initiative. And so in that, we're encouraging companies, whether it's a mom and pop operation that might have one employee, to the small to medium sized companies, to take a pledge that says that we'll make sure that our workplace is non-discriminatory when it comes to faith, and that we do our best to accommodate the religious needs of employees. So, and that we'll promote these values and share that we think that it's a good value and it's something worth sharing. So in that, no matter the size of your company, just becoming aware that that your employees need to feel like they can be authentic with their faith in the workplace. That can be done very easily. You don't have to start an employee group. I mean, if you have a small company, you're already a small group in itself. But maybe one guy in the company is different than the rest. And I'll give an example of a construction company in New York City, where you're located. Some years ago, they hired, it was a small company, relatively small company, started off as a family business. Mostly everyone was Jewish in that business. And they hired this guy named King. Well, his name was Hussein. And he was originally a Muslim from India, and he graduated from BYU, Brigham Young University, and along the way he became a Mormon. So here you have this, Muslim guy from India who's become a Mormon, and now he's working in a company with, with mostly Jewish employees and other engineers. And so when he started working there, they just realized how different he was, and so he picked up the name King while he was there, because the King Hussein from Jordan was in the news, and so they just gave him the nickname King. And so King then became a welcome employee. So they recognized his religious difference, and it wasn't a large company, but just being not trying to make him hide who he was, but welcoming him who he was. And then he's gone on to become quite successful in business. He is the CEO, founder, owner of Span Construction Company that builds all the Costcos around the United States and around the world. So that sort of religious inclusion, could happen at that level, and that's a story that he shares fondly. So when at a small company, might have one person who's a different faith than most everyone else, but recognizing them, encouraging them, is not only good for that person, but in his case, he went on to start a very successful company that you could say that's been a blessing to many others, or at least all the loyal Costco shoppers around the country, can be glad. And he continues to put his faith to practice at work. Even though there's a lot of deadlines for getting a new store built and started, he makes sure none of his employees have to work on Sundays. So making sure that they keep that Sabbath, that it's available to them if they want to use it. So that's just an example of sort of a small workplace, the impact it had on an individual, and then how he went on to become quite influential and successful in our economy.
And what you mentioned, are these traits transferable to other sectors like non-profits, to government agencies? Do you know of them taking advantage of this approach to diversity?
Yes, it's really available. It's a model that works everywhere. In fact, some of this is already working. If you think of the U.S. military, it has chaplains, it has faith groups meeting within the larger organization called the military. So that's one example. Within the government at large, like in the State Department, for example, they have these employee affinity groups as well, along the different identities such as sexual orientation, race, and in the last year or two, they've started now one on religion as well. So it's something that can work whether you're in a nonprofit environment, or you're in a government environment, or even a military environment.
Okay. And can we make comparisons? Do you have the data to make comparisons between the United States and Europe and countries within the EU? How is America faring compared to, or does one corporation that does something in America, e.g. Google or Facebook, do they follow on in Europe or other countries, Western countries, or even non-Western countries? How is the global trend? How does America compare to that trend?
So it works both ways. So sometimes these groups have started within an American, sort of the American headquarters of an American globalized company, and then it spreads. So I know like American Express, their groups are spreading to multiple countries. When we had awards recognizing some of these companies back in February, and we had a company like Intel, they brought in people from South America who were part of their network. So it could start in a company in America and then spread outwards. Sometimes it's stronger outside the U.S., like in the headquarters of Ernst & Young, EY, in London. They've been encouraging this kind of diversity. Their EY branch started a course called Religious Literacy for Organizations that they offer to clients. And so by having that sort of religious literacy, religious sensitivity within the EY corporate structure in London, it not only provided a business opportunity, but as different challenges have come up in the city of London, various terrorist attacks and others where people could start to stigmatize all Muslims because maybe the attack was carried out by a Muslim radical. Then within EY, they've been able to help the City of London respond by, say, having their Muslim employees standing with their Sikh employees, standing with their Christian employees and saying, look, we're all brothers here. What happened out there on the streets has nothing to do with the faith of my friend. So this kind of public engagement and public service is in dealing with these challenging issues benefits from this as well. So again, I think that in some ways, in some other countries, this is easier than in the United States. And I just mentioned the Muslim world at large. So in Muslim workplaces around the world, having time off to pray during the day, having special recognition of, fasting hours during Ramadan, sort of society is set up around religious practice. And so business takes on that same rhythm. So it's, when you get into countries that have a very strong, public activities of faith, it's a different situation. So, like I began by saying, in the United States, we've taken a much more secular sort of approach to at least the workplace. But these issues within people's hearts, they don't leave their hearts at home when they come to the workplace. So I think it's, it's coming, we're sort of seeing a tipping point in a good way to realizing that we have to be inclusive about that side of people as well.
You mentioned the Muslim world and how it may be attuned to people's faiths. And how they treat, for example, non-Muslim employees. Do you have any information regarding that?
Well, it varies by country. So I'll just give two examples from my own past. So I've worked for 20 years, I worked mostly in the Muslim majority world. So in Western China, in what was the Soviet Union and Soviet Central Asia, and then in the Gulf. So I worked and I'll give an example from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So both of these countries are on the Arabian Peninsula, same essentially big piece of sand. And in one country where I work, Saudi Arabia, my faith, I'm Catholic, was completely illegal. If I had mentioned anything about even saying Merry Christmas to my students, I was teaching there, I'd be fired and have to pay my own way home, lose 2 months' salary, pay my 4 kids at the time, living under the roof. It just would have, and who knows, and even worse, they had religious police who were policing things. So in that country, I just had no freedom. This was some years ago, but then I worked in the United Arab Emirates, and what a difference! Same piece of sand, you could say, but a completely different environment. There in that country, not only was my faith tolerated, it was welcomed. Sheikh Zayed, who was the founder of the country, was born in a hospital called Oasis Hospital that was run by Christian missionaries. And so he had a very, had a long positive history with people of different faiths. And so he then made it sort of a more open door policy. When our church needed a piece of land to have a place to meet, he gave that to the Catholic Church, and then our church was welcome there. And I was actually teaching there on 9/11 when 9/11 happened at the Zayed Military College, which is sort of their West Point. And on that day, the day after, the general had all the leadership into his office to discuss safety, because we had about 20,000 Taliban, or not Taliban, Afghanis and possible Taliban sympathizers living in that town. And they had rebelled before over some other issues. So it was a sticky situation. And so being in a country where they respected my faith, honored it, and then in that meeting, it came time for prayer. And the general looked over to the sergeant who had been serving us tea, and he said, "Hey, you're the best at this, you lead us." And then they invited me, said, "Well, we know you're not Muslim, but if you want, you can pray along too." And so, right in that work environment at a high point of high tension, there was a pause for prayer. It wasn't how I pray, but they welcomed me. They didn't exclude me. And so that, that's two different examples, two different experiences in, really on the same geographical area. So it really depends in the Muslim world, the policies the country adopts towards openness to other faiths, and certainly countries like the United Arab Emirates, where they've had very openness to people regardless of their faith or belief in general. They've done tremendously well economically, and probably the economic powerhouse of Dubai, which does not have oil, whereas Abu Dhabi does. They've benefited because they have been open. They're still a very conservative, strict Muslim society, but relative to some of their neighbors, much more open, and then they reap economic benefits from that as well.
Thank you, Brian. We have some questions. I'll forward you the first question. A business that is hiring chaplains but not rabbis or imams is exclusionary. Can you address this?
Could you say the question again? Because you were breaking up. Sorry.
Okay. A business that is hiring chaplains, but not rabbis or imams is exclusionary. Can you address this?
You mean if the business is hiring them, they're exclusionary?
Well, if they're hiring chaplains, I suspect the author of the questions is assuming that all chaplains are Christians, but they're not hiring rabbis or imams.
Yes. So so across America, there's chaplains of every faith. And of course, Christianity being the largest faith in the United States and having the most history of training and equipping chaplains, it's fair to say there's more Christian chaplains than there are chaplains from other faiths. But Tyson Food that I mentioned, one of their chaplains is Muslim. So it's not, these companies are not necessarily excluding chaplains from other faiths, but it's, it's in part related to their employees. If they have mostly Christian employees, it would make more sense to have Christian chaplains. Or more Christian chaplains. So I think that the point is right, that if you're in a company and your company has a variety of faiths, having chaplains who can meet those needs is very important. I'll add, though, that many of these chaplains not all of them, but many comes from a military chaplaincy background. And in the military, chaplains are charged with meeting the spiritual needs of the troops or the fleet. And so these chaplains, if you're, say, a Christian chaplain and there's no Jewish chaplain, nearby, and you have a Jewish soldier or sailor, then they're charged with meeting those needs as best they can. And vice versa, if there's a Jewish chaplain and there's no Christian chaplain nearby, that Jewish chaplain would be charged with meeting those needs. So the fact that a person is of one faith as a chaplain does not mean that they cannot meet the needs of people, maybe not in the same complete way someone of their same faith could, but that's sort of a basic tenet of chaplaincy, is that they're there to meet the spiritual, emotional, psychological needs of everyone, even if they have a different faith or no faith. You're on mute.
I am on mute. My apologies. We have another question. Please speak about collaborative activities where people of diverse faiths are engaging with each other and learning about one another.
One of the, just as one example, at American Airlines, one of their chief flight controllers in Dallas is also an Anglican priest. So he comes to work in the flight tower every day with his priest collar on, and he serves as a chaplain. But he's a flight controller and pilot, he's fully qualified. One of the activities that he does is every so often they have an event called Abraham's Tent. And then he works with other people from, this was just the Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It can apply to all faiths as well. But they have an event where they'll each come in and speak and tell people what they do in their services or what their faith is all about. And then people can say, well, I've heard this about Muslims. Is that true? Or I've heard this about Christians. Christians do this or don't do that. Is that true? So in that space, when they've opened that up, they've found that people are really curious about other faiths. One other example, I've mentioned Intel, and the head of their Christian group has reached out to the leaders of the different groups like their Muslim group, their Jewish group, their atheist agnostic group. They have a newly formed Baha'i group, and others, and then invited them to form sort of an informal coalition. So a few weeks ago, we had a conference call where we invited different people to come in, and each of those people from those different faith backgrounds, including the agnostic atheist group, each shared a thought of during this COVID-19 crisis, what is it from my faith that I draw strength from? And so we had, a beautiful prayer from each of the faith traditions, and a scripture or a thought that they wanted to share. So again, these kind of encounters are not what you can think of as this sort of ecumenical ecumenism, where people are trying to just find something that's they can find a commonality. Instead, they're asking people to come and share, what does it mean as a Christian, or as a Muslim, or a Baha'i person, or a Hindu, or an atheist? What are these? What resources do you have within your soul from your faith that helps you deal with what's going on around us, and share that with us? So that's a different. They're not trying to. They're not trying to do sort of what we would call interfaith, sort of advocacy, but it's coming together as people of faith. So it's really a unique model that I think is something very encouraging for our country, because we often see that division falls, along political lines, but then that can map over ethnic and religious lines. And here inside of companies, I'm seeing that these matters of faith are not matters of division, but can be matters where people can meet and have really meaningful, loving conversations.
Thank you, Brian. We have another question. How do these companies monitor possible improvements in religious exclusion in their workplaces?
Say that again. How do they
monitor possible improvements in religious inclusion in their workplaces?
So as I mentioned before, there hasn't been a lot of benchmarking in this. We have developed a benchmarking tool called the CRDA, the Corporate Religious Diversity Assessment Tool, together with another organization in New York called Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. And with this tool is one way companies can track this. So it's free, it's online, it's crdatool.org. And what they do is they look at this corporate pledge that we have, where they pledge that freedom of religion or beliefs good for society, that they won't discriminate on the basis of religion or belief. They'll accommodate as best they can religious concerns in the workplace, and they'll share this value with others. So then this CRDA tool then helps companies track what they're doing on each of those points, and gives them a score. It's nothing that we publicize, but it helps companies take an assessment of where they are now, and then periodically take that same test again and give them some measures and goals to aim for. And you're still on mute.
Yes, learning curve of doing this. Thank you, Brian. Now we have another question, and that is follow-up. When it comes to ERGs, and that stands for Employee Resource Groups, would you generally encourage interfaith ERGs or religion-specific ERGs to most corporations? And there's a follow-up, the same author, as in true corporations look primarily at supporting Christian ERGs and Muslim ERGs or interfaith ERGs, or what would you look at to guide that decision?
So I think the answer to that question is that different things work in different companies. So for instance, I mentioned several companies like Salesforce, and they've sort of begun their push into this with an interfaith group called Faith Force. And but then with underneath that Faith Force, you can have Christian group meetings or meetings by individual faiths sort of under that umbrella. Other companies like American Airlines, they have a Muslim group, a Christian group, a Jewish group, but then they also have a group called Mosaic that is inclusive of many other faiths and beliefs. They also have a Pacific group and an India, sort of South Asia group, and that tends to map along, Hinduism and other faiths. So, they have that diversity within it, but they haven't tried to put everything under one single interfaith group. So I think much of this comes out of the corporate culture itself, and the needs within a company. So there was a large company that the CEO thought, well, this is a good idea. I'm gonna do this, and he set up a group, and nobody joined, and it failed. So why would that be? Well, the reason is that these employee groups are being formed because employees feel the need, not because the boss says you should have this. This is something that they're looking for. So within different corporate environments and different companies, it may come about in different ways, and I think that's been a good thing. And that there's not just one single model that fits all companies, and I think that's what gives it strength and dynamism. And companies learn from each other, so they share experiences back and forth. What's happening in one might inform what another company does, but it doesn't completely determine it. And I'll just give an example from Google. Their group is called the Interbelief Network. And so as they started their group, they didn't want it to just be for, as I mentioned, religious people. So, that in their corporate environment where they wanted to make sure agnostics, atheists, people with other beliefs that aren't traditional religious beliefs felt included as well. So sort of from their corporate culture, they realized they wanted to have an initiatives that made everyone feel welcome. And for them, that's the direction they went. Other companies, they just might, it just might not be the same felt need. So it's important that the company does this organically and doesn't just impose something that nobody's asking for.
And I'm not a mute. And from the other end, if we have an employee that feels the need to express their faith, is there advice you can provide for them in a workplace that either maybe hostile or maybe neutral, but they're looking for opportunities to be able to take a prayer break or some type of reflection or something regarding food and what have you, permission of kosher or halal? Is there any tactics that they should follow? Are there risks in smaller companies? What advice would you give to those in America and really broadly the West or even around the world?
Well, if you talk about around the world, laws vary from country to country on religion and the workplace. But in the United States and many other countries, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of religion in your hiring, firing, promotions, job assignments, all of these things. So for any employee, just realize that religion is not illegal. In fact, it's illegal for the company to discriminate on the basis of religion. So that's where we begin from in the United States, that that as people we have rights, and it's a right guaranteed by law that we can't be discriminated against because of our faith. And so that, so rather than feeling defensive, which some people do, or they try to hide, so from a Christian, hide their light under a bushel, something Jesus told us not to do. They sort of be quiet about it. So that's, we don't want people to feel like that. That's not healthy, and it's, and if they're forced to feel like that, a company could run into legal trouble. So but the other question is, not being discriminated against is one thing, but being accommodated is a little bit more difficult, because the law says that a company should accommodate people's religious needs as long as it doesn't create an undue hardship. So for instance, if you're from a faith that prohibits from you to drink alcohol, consume alcohol, and then you want to apply for a job as a bartender and say, well, I can do everything except serve alcohol. That would be an undue hardship on the employer. So there are limits to, what you should expect an employer to accommodate, and so it has to be reasonable and not cause an undue hardship. So I think the best thing to do is just to raise the discussion. For instance, if you want to pray at a certain time, or if you want to be able to go to church on Sunday, or pray on Friday, or not work from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, as Seventh-day Adventists do and many Orthodox Jews practice. So to mention that to your boss and say, that I really need this accommodation, and begin that discussion. And then other things such as you could say, you mentioned prayer in the workplace, or Bible study, or something like that. So it depends on the policy of the company. So if the company says, no, we don't allow any space of the company to be used for anything that's not work related, okay, then that's fine. Then okay, if they won't let us have a Bible study, that means they're not going to let the sewing club have a sewing meeting or something like that. But if the company allows that space to be used for something that's sort of extracurricular, then if you'd want to propose having a Bible study, well, then that's sort of fairer game. So it depends on the company. If the company allows people to send out blast emails and say, come support the, we're having a charity drive to support X, Y, and Z, and you send it to everybody, and come join us. And then somebody else wants to send out an invitation for people to come and join a prayer meeting. So if they're allowing one thing, then they should allow another. So it really depends on companies having very clear policies around this issue, and then and being reasonable with how they develop those policies, so they're not anti-religious or overly pro one religion and not another.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. I want to thank you for coming today and speaking with us during this very interesting discussion, very relevant, of course, particularly for those in New York and the many corporations that find themselves here in Manhattan. Just as a background for those that are further interested, you can visit Brian Grimm's organization, Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, at their website, religiousfreedomandbusiness.org, for the report and other opportunities to be able to engage with Brian's important work. I want to thank all our attendees today. Please, of course, subscribe to our YouTube, give us a thumbs up. Hopefully you enjoyed this interesting session. And of course, visit our other social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our website. And we look forward to hosting you on another occasion. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.